Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Where is my hammer? Hello, everyone. If you would be so kind to take your places so that the meeting can start. Since we have a full house, would you please keep quiet? So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you. First of all, I would like to welcome Madam Margrethe Vestager, whose subject to positive outcome of this hearing will be the Executive Vice President for a Europe fit for the digital age. I would also like to welcome everyone present in the room today, as well as those who are watching us since this meeting is web-streamed. This hearing is organized jointly with the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protection, and I welcome Madam De Sutter, Chair of IMCO, and with the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, and I welcome Madam Tinagli, the Chair of ECON Committee. We will jointly chair this meeting. Also, I would like to welcome the members of the Jury Committee, which is associated to the hearing, and of the Employment and Libe Committees, which are invited. From our perspective, ITRE Committee, let me recall you that Madam Vestager has been entrusted by the President-elect with the task of ensuring that Europe fully grasps the potential of the digital age and strengthens its industry and innovation capacity. This will be a key part of reinforcing our technological leadership and strategic autonomy. Madam Vestager will also co-lead the Commission's work on a new long-term strategy for Europe's industrial future and a new SMEs strategy. She will also coordinate the work on a European approach on artificial intelligence to be presented in the first 100 days of the new Commission. Moreover, she will ensure coordination between civil, defence and space industries, and all these policies areas are key for the ITRE Committee, will be at the heart of Mrs. Vestager's mandate. So that's why, Madam Commissioner, we are here today listening very careful to what you intend to do to make a success out of this portfolio from industrial point of view. So, thank you very much. Now I'll give the floor to Madame De Sutter for introductory remarks.
Yes, well, there's three of us, so you will have to listen to all three of us first. And I, of course, on behalf of IMCO, I would like to welcome the Executive Vice President-designate, Margrethe Vestager, for this joint hearing. The IMCO committee, of course, is responsible for the coordination of internal market rules and the functioning of the single market, including the digital single market. Digitization is transforming every sector of the economy, and it has implications for businesses, consumers and society as a whole. The single market is one of the EU's greatest achievements, and it is essential that in this era of digital transformation it remains a great success. That is why we do need to make sure that our internal market rules are fit for the digital age, and we have to do it in a way that wins the trust of consumers and creates a level playing field for businesses. In short, I believe the digital transformation has to be inclusive. It has to benefit everyone. We also understand very well that a strong single market means avoiding fragmentation, and it means avoiding artificial distinctions between more traditional, let's call them offline markets, and newer digital or online markets. There is only one single market, of course. I will continue by making some procedural remarks. In line with the guidelines for the approval of the Commission, Parliament evaluates the Commissioners designate on the basis of their general competence, European commitment and personal independence. It also assesses the knowledge of their prospective portfolio and their communication skills. Before the hearing, Mrs. Vestager replied in writing to a preparatory questionnaire. The written answers have been distributed to members in all languages. And the Committee on Legal Affairs finally has raised no objection to the holding of the hearing. So I will now give the floor to the chair of ECON, Mrs. Tinagli.
Thank you. Thank you. Does it work? Yes. In the name of the ECON committee, I would also like to welcome all of you here today, and I would also like to welcome Mrs. Margrethe Vestager, whom the ECON committee already knows very well as a Commissioner for Competition for the last 5 years. Ms. Vestager has been designated to continue her work on the competition portfolio, which is a crucial part of the work done at the European level for the benefit of our firms and our citizens. In her capacity as Executive Vice President for a Europe fit for the digital age, Ms. Margrethe Vestager should also coordinate within the new Commission the work on digital taxation in order to find, by the end of 2020, a consensus at international level, or alternatively with the aim of proposing a fair European digital tax. In accordance with the EP rules of procedure, both competition and taxation are main competences of the ECON committee. So, before starting, please allow me to recall how this hearing will be conducted. Ms. Vestager will be invited to make an opening statement of no longer than 15 minutes. She will also have 5 minutes at the end of the meeting for a closing statement. After the introduction, there will be time for 25 questions from MEPs. The debate will be held with slots of 5 minutes each, with 1 minute for the question and 2 minutes for the answers. In case of follow-up questions, the questions should not be longer than 1 minute each and 1 minute for the reply. So the first round of 7 questions will be asked by representatives of political groups. The second round of 18 questions is based on the overall distributions of questions among the political groups, including also a representative from a non-attached members. So just let me also remind you that all chairs will be very strict on the indicated speaking time, and we will not allow speakers to exceed their allocated time. Should the first question exceed the 1 minute or even 2 minutes, follow-up questions will not be allowed. Interpretation will be provided in 23 languages. You can therefore use your own language, but please remember that what you say needs to be interpreted, so please do not speak too quickly. Ms. Vestager, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, honourable chairs, honourable members. 5 years ago, the European Parliament confirmed me as Commissioner for Competition. That was one of the proudest moments of my life. I was given the opportunity to work for European citizens with this Parliament for the values that has guided my work in politics for 30 years. I've always worked for a fair and just society where people can make their own choices, follow their own dreams, in due respect for others. If I'm confirmed, I will continue to do so in my role as Executive Vice President for making Europe fit for the digital age. I firmly believe that we best achieve our common goals when we work together. That was my belief when I first walked through the doors of this Parliament as a trainee. And in the years since, I have seen what our European democracy has done to build a society that works for people and represents its people. And Europe will strive for more. I'm very happy that we now have the first gender-balanced Commission. We face great challenges ahead of us. Just to name a few, climate change and the digital transformation. Both will affect every part of our daily lives. And as global competition gets tougher, we'll need to work harder to preserve a level playing field. We have what it takes to face those challenges if we work together. We have values that we can be proud of, values of freedom and fairness and democracy. And these have made Europe the best place to live in history. Europe is filled with highly skilled people. We have excellent infrastructure. We have fair and effective laws. Our single market gives European businesses room to grow and to innovate and be the best in the world at what they do. So my pledge is not to make Europe more like China or more like America. My pledge is to help Europe make more like herself, to build on our own strength and values, so that our society is both strong and fair, and that for all of Europeans. In the last 5 years, I've seen how enforcing competition rules can make markets work for people and not the other way around. And I'm proud of the work that we have done. But there's still a lot to do. So I'm deeply honored that the President-elect has asked me to continue my work on competition. I will do that with the same energy and the same dedication as ever, and with the same commitment to independence and impartiality as I gave this Parliament 5 years ago. Because independence in law enforcement is non-negotiable. The competition rules, they don't make it a crime to be big, but dominant companies, they do have a special responsibility not to use their powers to harm consumers. Companies are also free to merge, just as long as they still remain subject to challenge. Because companies cannot deny consumers the benefits of effective competition, affordable prices, a choice of products, and innovative products that better serves their needs. And obviously, we also have to make sure that state aid doesn't harm competition. Because Europeans deserve an economy where companies compete to serve customers better, not just to get bigger subsidies from government. These are challenging times. And they are also challenging in competition enforcement, because markets are changing fast. And we have even bigger changes ahead of us. Human nature, though, basic motives like greed and fear, they don't change. So the principles that guide our competition rules, they are as relevant today as they were when the Treaty of Rome was signed, now more than 60 years ago. But we need to make sure that the way we apply those principles is fit for a world that is changing fast. So I will move forward with the review that we started on our rules of antitrust, on mergers and state aid. And in this process, we will be guided and helped by the insights that we have gained by looking into how digitization affects competition, including the independent report from 3 special advisors, which they delivered earlier this year. I believe that fair competition is important to prepare our economy for the challenges ahead. But competition is not enough. We need a strategy for Europe's industrial future that is based on what makes Europe strong, our openness and our diversity. So the industrial strategy, it must be for everyone, it must be green, it must be based on fair competition. And this work will include coming up with a new strategy to support the heart of the European economy, the small and medium-sized businesses. Together, they account for more than half of Europe's business income. They employ nearly 2/3 of people working, and they offer much-needed training for our young people. And fundamentally, those businesses, what they ask of us is to create a fair marketplace and to remove the barriers that stop them from growing. Our public and private sector also needs to team up to get the best of each other. And that means a more strategic use of public procurement, more funding for research and innovation in business. And it means working together with member states on important projects of common European interest. We will bring together entire value chains from universities, suppliers, manufacturers, all the ways to those who recycle the raw material that is used in manufacturing. And this strategy, our strategy, needs to reach beyond the single market. As we get more and more interconnected, we are more dependent and affected by decisions made by others. Europe is the biggest trading partner of some 80 countries, including China and the US. So we are in a strong position to work for a level global playing field. This includes pursuing our proposal to reform the World Trade Organization. It includes giving ourselves the right tools to make sure that foreign state ownership and subsidies do not undermine fair competition in Europe. A good industrial strategy also makes Europe fit for the digital age. Because basically there are two types of businesses today. Those that are already digital and those that will soon be. And digitization has enormous potential of making our lives better. But to unlock that potential, we need the right rules to give people confidence in the digital transformation. It should serve citizens. It should respect our fundamental values. Today I want to emphasize 3 values in particular: trust, humanity, and fairness. And let me give you some examples of what I will do in the 5 years ahead, if confirmed. On trust. We need to engage with people's concerns about technology and in that process build trust. I will work on a Digital Services Act that includes upgrading our liability and safety rules on digital platforms, services and products. And we also need to regulate the way that companies collect and use and share data so that it benefits all of society. On humanity, we need rules to make sure that artificial intelligence is used ethically, to support human decision-making and not to undermine it. I will put forward proposals developing the European approach for artificial intelligence within the first 100 days of my term in office. And on fairness, fair working conditions and fair taxation are amongst the foundations of a decent society. So we need to make sure that platform workers enjoy fair conditions. And we also need to make sure that digital companies pay their fair share of taxes. We want these taxation rules to be based on global agreement. But if that is not possible by the end of 2020, we are prepared to act. So we face a challenging task, not only to set, but also to apply the right rules so these fast-moving markets respect our fundamental values and unlock the digital potential that will make our life better, be it in healthcare, in transport, in the fight against climate change. For this task, I hope and trust that I can call upon the cooperation of this Parliament. In the past 5 years, I have often discussed proposals and ideas with honourable members, and I think our truly open dialogue has made it possible for new legislation to be adopted quickly. If confirmed, I will continue this open and cooperative way to work with you in every step of the legislative process. And I very much look forward to continue working with your committees. After all, Europe is about teamwork. And today, when we face some of the biggest challenges of our lifetimes, we need more than ever to work together so we can make sure that Europe remains the best place to live in all of history. And, if I may add, especially if you're a woman. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vestager. Now I give the floor to Andreas Schwab from IMCO EPP.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. Commissioner Designate, also a warm welcome from our side. You have been a hidden star in the Juncker Commission, and the Financial Times of today even calls you the Chief Supremo. Congratulations. However, the technical and political questions ahead of us are a real challenge. You have mentioned it, especially with the new role that is given to you in the next 5 years. The digital single market is full of hidden stars that unfortunately often don't shine for long. Und deswegen mache ich auf Deutsch weiter. Die digitale Plattformwirtschaft, Frau.
The digital platform economy has brought us huge advantages, but we still have regulatory barriers in place, and this is a real obstacle for these types of companies to grow really quickly, not just in the digital area, but in our more traditional industries as well. We are seeing an increase in really unfair competition from around the world, and that's what's led to this call for European champions. The EU competition policy has as its main aim to have better services or better prices through these types of mergers. Would you stick to this principle? And what is planned by the Commission under you as the Vice President to make things easier for companies rather than having investments from outside of the EU privileged due to the rules that we have?
Well, you are indeed right to say that we have a dual challenge here. On the one hand side, to secure fair competition within our single market, so that customers and consumers are well served, and at the same time to stand up for our European businesses when they are met with unfair competition outside of Europe. I think we all have not only a feeling but also facts to back up that this may be the case. That sometimes they're faced with competitors who do not get their financing in the same competitive manner as a European company would have to fight for their financing. So a set of things will have to be done. And I think important steps were taken when this Commission suggested a change, for instance, in our approach to China. Say, well, China is anything but a developing economy. In some areas, it's a strategic partner in climate change, but it's also a strategic competitor. And we have to react to that. And here, I hope to work with colleagues to secure us the international procurement instrument, because we need reciprocity. When we invite people into our market, we should also be invited to theirs. And the market for procurement in Europe is about, I think, 15% of European GDP. It's a lot of money. Second, we should make sure that when foreigners invest in Europe, that they do that for the right purposes. Obviously, we welcome investors, but they should come here for business reasons. One of the open questions is, of course, to make sure that if a state-owned company from abroad buys a European business, that not foreign state aid is coming into Europe undermining the level playing field here. And here we work with colleagues of trade, of single market, in order to get a functional tool, because that, unfortunately, we don't have yet, but it's a matter of high priority.
30 seconds for follow-up.
Sie haben jetzt viel auf die Zusammenarbeit mit Ihren Kollegen.
You have talked a lot about cooperation with your colleagues. Now, we have heard about measures against US technology companies. I think it's important we have these types of hearings, because when these types of measures are taken, Parliament needs to be involved here as well. I think when we talk about the social market economy, we need to uphold these particular principles. So can you ensure that these rules we have will be used more quickly in the digital area so that when there are any abuses, they'll be tackled as quickly as possible?
Well, this has indeed been one of my areas of, if not frustration, then intense work. Because I completely agree. Markets are moving fast. The law is moving the way the law is moving. Obviously, to some degree, there is an inherent asymmetry here. There's a limit as to how fast law enforcement can work, because we will never compromise on due process. On the other hand side, we should be able to work as fast as possible. And we actually have a case right now where we are trying to use what we call interim measures. Where we're saying to a business, you've got to stop what you're doing, because we think that you harm competition. And when you stop, we will then do, of course, the full casework in order to prove the harm that's being done. And that, of course, is a first for 20 years. But I think it's a good reflection of the fact that we find it a very high priority to speed up in what we do.
Thank you. And now Paul Tang from ECON S&D.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Margrethe Vestager. Let's talk the downsides of the digital age, the concentration of money and power. First, the current corporate tax system is outdated, so that many multinational and certainly the tech giants hardly pay any taxes. This calls for action. Will you push for a European digital service tax if international negotiations fail to produce a result? And will you continue pursuing state aid cases, even though the European Court of Justice has annulled the fine against Starbucks? Second, the American tech giants seem to see your fines as an operating expense. We see no European competitors in sight, and our data are at the mercy of commercial interest. What do you intend to do to fundamentally change this, to promote European success, and at the same time to protect the data, our data, of European users against the potential abuses of American tech giants?
Well, first and foremost, I also hope that member states are listening right now. Because the state aid cases, they will not give us a fair tax system. In that, we need to change legislation. Because I completely agree. Corporate taxation was invented way, way, way before the first computer ever saw the day of light. So also corporate taxation will have to be digitalized. Otherwise, well, we will have less and less and less contribution from businesses to the societies where they do their business. But the state aid cases have shown the light on some businesses who get an advantage which is for them only, and that is definitely not fair. And yes, we will continue. We still have open cases, and we have just asked every member state to give us a status of how they use tax rulings in order to update all the material we have from when we did this the last time a couple of years ago. But on taxes, yes, we will continue. I hope that we can find global agreement, as we did in the project of avoiding base erosion and profits being shifted, which is now European law. But if we cannot find that global agreement, yes, we do intend to act ourselves. And I think it's very important to keep up the pressure, just as individual member states are doing right now, because they say, well, we have to be able to answer the calls from our businesses for fair taxation. So yes, indeed, this will be a matter of high priority. On the question of how to deal with businesses who break the law, who do things that are illegal, well, the fine is just a part of it. On average, I think our fines are between 4 and 6% of global turnover. And that is part of what is the punishment for bad behavior in the past. But looking forward, we will do two things. We'll say, first of all, you have to stop what you're doing. You cannot do something that has the same effect as what you did. And obviously, we have more tools in the toolbox to say, well, what will it take to reinstate competition in this market? And obviously, as we get wiser and wiser, we also get better and better in seeing what will it take For instance, to have a free choice when it comes to operating systems.
Thank you. Any follow-up question?
Please, because it's good that we get wiser and wiser, but I take it that the fines are a first attempt to make an inroad in the market power of tech giants. But can you tell us a bit more what you have learned and what you expect will be effective in fighting the monopoly power of the tech giants and leading to the situation where European competitors have no room to develop? The Parliament has said several times, for example, that you should consider the breakup of, let's say, Google or Facebook. Is that an option that's on the table?
It wasn't the choice of operating system, it was the choice of search and browsers that are now being enabled by one of the remedies in the Google Android case. And this is an example of how a business also changes its behavior in order to open a marketplace that was otherwise, because of illegal behavior, completely occupied by themselves. On the question of breaking up companies, well, this is a tool that we have available. It can be done. The thing is, I have an obligation to use the least intrusive tool in order to restore fair competition. And since it is quite a thing to break up a company, obviously I have an obligation to try what else could be a good tool to solve the situation that we're in. The second thing, and I think that is sometimes underappreciated, at least I don't see it myself too much, is the fact that we as consumers see the American giants. But a lot of European businesses, they see European businesses as their preferred partner when it comes to digital services. In hardware, in a number of software issues, in the business-to-business environment, Europe has a lot to offer as well.
Thank you. Now, Nicola Beer from ITRE, Renew Europe.
Yes, thank you. Europa fit for
Europe fit for the digital age. That's a very interesting challenge. And one point which is going to play a role is the addressing of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, this is a very promising tool, and that could really benefit citizens in Europe because this new technology could be used in the health sector, better education, individual mobility, for example, for persons with disabilities. We could protect our environment. We could have better security for our citizens. So for citizens and the economy, there are quite a lot of opportunities. Do you agree with us that this kind of innovative potential of artificial intelligence should be used because it's so significant, even though, of course, we're aware of the challenges and the risks? And how would you react in a strategic fashion so that we don't just use the potential, but rather as Europeans, we become the leaders in this field? How can the EU in the coming 5 years come forward with good examples to lead us?
I agree on the potential, but I also see the risks. And as we speak, Europeans are losing trust in technology. So to get the benefits, we have to build trust at the same time to make sure that this is technology that actually serves us as humans and as citizens. There's been a high-level expert group on AI, which has developed 7 guiding principles as to how to develop trustworthy AI. And this is not something just done by a desk. This is something that is useful for businesses, because a very high number of businesses, they have signed up to use these principles and an assessment list when they develop AI for their businesses. And we will have the results in by December, and that, of course, will inform the work that we do. So that on the one hand side we can invest, but on the other hand side make people see that this is for us. And some say, well, the Chinese, they have all the data. And the Americans, they have all the money. But when I see what we have going for us in Europe is that we have purpose. Where you find great European AI is in health it's in environment, it's in transportation organization. It is where you want to see AI being used for a greater purpose. And that, I find, is a good inspiration to figure out how to make data available and how to find the funds so that we can invest more. Because obviously more investment is needed. Europe is behind on a factor, I think, 3 or 4 when it comes to investing in AI. And we don't have the same data availability. But the most important driver is, of course, what it is that we want to achieve.
Thank you. And now, Alexandra Gies. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. The follow-up question. Yes, I apologize.
Yes, just a brief follow-up question. You said quite correctly that we need investment in order to really exploit the potential of these developments. We also have to defend our values. So in the coming 5 years, how would you like to achieve a pooling of the potential of the member states so that we can go beyond simple fragmentation?
First priority is, of course, that the budget for the next 7 years can be passed so that we can get to work. From this Commission, we have proposed that we increase our investments quite a lot in order to be able to do all this kind of stuff. And the second thing is, of course, also to use public procurement more strategically. It is, I think, public procurement in Europe is 2 with 12 zeros after in euros. It's a lot of money. And if we also use that to ask for solutions, well, then we can have also maybe smaller businesses to say, well, I can actually do that. This is what I can deliver. So we can make an AI strategy that will push in all different sectors of society. Also because by now Europe has a number of innovative hubs. Now you don't just go to Paris for the Eiffel Tower. You can go there for looking at startups and innovative ecosystems. So if we build on what we have going for ourselves, I think we can achieve it.
Thank you. And now, Alexandra Gies, IMCO Greens.
Here.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Executive Vice President Designate. The upcoming Digital Services Act is a huge opportunity to get things right in the digital market. GDPR was a milestone, but there's still a striking power imbalance that European citizens and consumers are facing today. Ad tech-driven micro-targeting enables disinformation campaigns and political interference, strongly influences consumers, and leads to what some even call surveillance capitalism. What I would like to hear from you today is a clear commitment to the high data protection and fundamental rights standards already set. But furthermore, I would like to know how seriously you plan to fight the existing power imbalance. Are you ready to tackle ad tech-driven business models as a whole? Are you willing to take certain data exploitation practices like micro-targeting completely off the table?
One of the things I have learned from surveillance capitalism and these ideas is basically that it's not you searching Google, it is Google searching you. And that gives a very good idea about not only what you want to buy, but also what you think. So we have indeed a lot to do. I am in completely agreement with what has been done so far, because we needed to do something fast. So the code of conduct, the code of practice, is a very good start to make sure that we get things right. Because we couldn't sort of sacrifice neither the European election nor the national elections coming up, because we needed regulation to be put in place. So in that respect, I think we have a lot to build on. I don't know yet what should be the details of the Digital Services Act. And I think it's very important that we make the most of what we have, since we're in a hurry. Also to take stock of what I would call digital citizens' rights, the GDPR, that we can have national authorities enforce that in full, and hopefully also to have a market response so that we have privacy by design and being able to choose that. because I think it's very important that we also get a market response to say, well, you can actually do things in a very different way than just to allow yourself to be, at least to feel forced to sign up to whatever terms and conditions that are put in front of you. I myself find it very thought-provoking if you have the time just once in a while to read the terms and conditions. Now, when they're obliged, thanks to this Parliament, to write in a way that you can actually understand, that makes it even more scary. And very often it just makes me think, thanks, but no thanks. And that, of course, is the other side of that coin. Yes, regulation, but also for us as citizens to be much more aware of what kind of life we want to live and what kind of democracy we want to have, because it cannot just be digital. Then I think we will lose it.
Yes, follow-up question?
Staying in the digital sphere and speaking about trust and fairness, we have already heard about the great potential of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making. But they also bear the risk of direct or indirect discrimination. Studies and evidence have shown that women, people of color, LGBTQI, and poor people are often disadvantaged by those systems. So with regard to the legislative framework for artificial intelligence that you mentioned, announced for the first 100 days, how do you plan to make sure that algorithmic systems as a whole are not discriminatory, especially with regard to biased data sets?
I share this concern. Usually I'd say, well, you can have your AI when I have a gender-balanced society. Because the problem of AI is that it's not any wiser than the data you feed it. And the pattern that it finds, it seems, well, these are the right patterns. And these are, of course, man-made. So there is a risk that if we don't do something, we just cement the inequalities that we have already, instead of actually doing our best to change it. One of the principles of creating trustworthy AI, I think it's number 5, exactly addresses this, that if you will not in itself design your AI to get rid of the biases, then you need to have human oversight so that you can self-correct. And that I find to be very important. And these principles now we'll, of course, see on the feedback that we get from all the different businesses that have tried it out, how it will work. But I think this question about how to avoid biases, this is one of the core questions when we are to discuss how to put a framework in place that will allow us to trust the technology.
Thank you. Alessandra Basso, IMCO ID.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Vestager, you said often that you need to guarantee a fair level playing field when it comes to competition conditions throughout the world, and you want to develop the conditions to guarantee fair competition, both in the internal market and indeed throughout the world. I think personally that's a bit too ambitious, given that, looking at my own country, you haven't actually managed to get a much more simple situation under control. The Tercas case, which, as you'll be aware, led to the collapse of 4 banks and has caused considerable problems for an awful lot of savers and consumers. So what kind of instruments are you going to develop to guarantee world-level fair competition, and so that Europe can play on an equal footing? Thank you.
Exactly the banking sector is one of the sectors that has suffered longest from the financial crisis. And it may be so that now we have had growth in euro countries and non-euro countries and jobs are being created, but still for many businesses it's difficult to pay back their loans. And that, of course, is reflected in a banking sector that then have non-performing loans, loans that are not being paid back. And this is why one should be very careful to say, well, everything is fine, now it's back to normal, we just move on. One has to be careful. And every case in the banking sector has been different. What we have been doing is, of course, to make sure that taxpayers are being protected, that as much value as possible is being protected. But that doesn't change the fact that once in a while, a bank will leave the market, very likely being bought by other banks, and it will be very painful. And sometimes extraordinarily painful, because there's been mis-selling taking place. Mis-selling when consumers do not really know what product. They think maybe it's a simple savings product that they're completely safe, even if the banks get into trouble, and then it turns out that they're not. And this is why we have been trying to help out by organizing schemes that allows for compensation for mis-selling automatically if it's customers in a very vulnerable economic situation, and one by one if it is in a situation where more work is done in order to establish what kind of money has been lost due to mis-selling.
Follow-up question?
Sì, avrò un'altra domanda da porre.
Yes, another question, still on the subject of competition. We all know how important this is. You said yourself it's vital that companies be allowed to compete under equal conditions, and that this is really a sine qua non for an internal market that really works. So, in order to avoid further distortion in the internal market, will you, and how would you, revise the guidelines on state financial assistance in the maritime sector? This is a sector that's not covered, as others were, in the January fitness check. Thank you.
No, you're right that the maritime guidelines, they're not covered by the fitness check because they were they had their own process, they were running ahead. We had an extensive public consultation to see if they were fit for purpose, but they had their own go. And we got quite a broad feedback, some saying we don't need it anymore, some say, well, actually they works quite well, and few say they have to be changed. So for the maritime guidelines, to a very large degree, they will continue as they are. But that will not change that we will still focus on the maritime sector. One of the things that enables a very strong European maritime sector is the fact that we have tonnage tax. And we've been working these 5 years to make sure that tonnage tax stays legitimate. I think that it is crucial for European shipping that we have the tonnage tax system. It's also important for European flagging. And this we will continue to do to enable the tonnage tax to be used as it should be for shipping activities. But we have had quite a number of cases where we saw tonnage tax being actually used for a number of purposes, and we've had to limit that. So the maritime sector will obviously remain a priority.
Thank you. And now Mr. Epping from ECR, ECON.
Madam Commissioner, you have been given 2 portfolios, Executive Vice President for Europe Fit for the Digital Age and Competition Commissioner. I'm interested in hearing from you how you will avoid potential conflict of interest. The goal of competition enforcement is ensuring that competition leads to long-run consumer welfare. It requires neutrality towards the nationality of the firm in question. Industrial strategy, on the other hand, aims at promoting particular sectors and companies, as well as political priorities of strategic autonomy. It implies a more interventionist approach in the form of an industrial strategy. Do you recognize the tension between objective competition enforcement and industrial policy interests in your portfolio? How are you going to reconcile them? Are you, for example, going to build Chinese walls, or any wall for that matter, in your portfolio?
That was obviously the first question I asked myself. Because otherwise, how can you ask or accept such a challenge? Because the independence in law enforcement is non-negotiable. Because it rests on the evidence of the case, the facts, the case law, not what country you are, not what size, nothing else. And two different perspectives to that. One is, of course, the way that we are set up here in the European Commission, that DG Comp and the Commissioner for Competition is part of the Commission as such, and has been so since the very first days. So it has always been so that the Commissioner for Competition has been part of the college. And every decision we take, also in competition, is a collegial decision. What justifies that is, of course, that every decision is subject to not one, but 2 times legal scrutiny, if need be. And the latest confirmation of this setup was 2 judgments in 2011, where it was looked into whether this setup, where you have the college and the collegial decisions, and the court scrutinizing both on substance and the legality of the cases afterwards, if that was in accordance with our human rights. And that has been found to be so. So the setup as such is as it should be. The second perspective is, of course, how do we work on a day-to-day basis? And one of the things that distinguishes my work and that I very much appreciate is that in the working of my teams and myself in the decision-making, we have the independent advice of our chief economist, and we have the advice of the legal service. And the legal service, they know that they will have to defend the cases in court, which means, of course, that they are very particular that there is no interference from anything else than what they can defend. And for the chief economist to give an independent perspective as to what we do, exactly to do, as you say, to separate policy from law enforcement.
Thank you. Follow-up question?
Yes, Madam Commissioner. Both the EU and the US have well-developed competition policies. They have similar objectives, but different. The EU has an administrative system for antitrust enforcement, while in the US, approach is based on criminal law. Merger control is more centralized in the EU than in the US. EU competition policy has strict rules on state aid, whereas US legislation has no provisions in the area. Do you consider that the EU can learn from the US in some areas, and if so, how?
We learn quite a lot on a case-by-case working relationship. When we have the clearances from companies, for instance, in a merger, then we can work with the case teams of the US authorities to help each other out. For instance, to make sure that if there is a competition concern in a merger, and a divestiture is needed, that remedy may work both for the US authority and for us as an authority, so that we limit the burden of merger control on the businesses that are going to merge. So we have a cooperation where we do learn from one another. They have a different system in the US. I can recognize your description completely, but I find that the basic ideas, they are the same. Also because we learned initially a lot from the US, both when it comes to antitrust and merger control. These are things that we got from the US in the first place. State aid is a European specificity, but one of the things that I have noted is that a number of voices in the US start to question, for instance, the fact that individual member states will give huge tax breaks to companies in order to have their headquarters placed in one of those states. What I think is important is that the entire global competition community discusses and inspires one another to do what we find is suited to make sure that we have fair competition in each and every jurisdiction.
Thank you. Now, Martin Schürdewan, ECON IMCO from GUE.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Vorsitzende.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Commissioner. In your introductory comments, you talked about having a more fair and equal society. I'm very pleased to hear that. That's what my political group would like to see too. But are we also going to have fair corporate tax? Now, you are responsible for putting in place a fairer digital tax. I know there have been discussions within the framework of the G20. Parliament had put forward a very progressive draft in the last mandate as to what such a tax could look like, how this could be implied, and how this would affect small and medium-sized enterprises and more innovative companies as well. But a more fair tax system in any case. Will you be representing this position in the G20? And if this simply doesn't work in that framework because there are too many different positions, will we see a European process, and how do you overcome a block in Council?
It's always difficult to be really optimistic when it comes to European tax legislation. Because it takes a long time, and when we get results, it takes time to get it all implemented on ground. But that being said, I have been myself surprised about progress actually made. When I was minister in Denmark, Denmark held the presidency, and I was head of the ECOFIN Council. And we were pushing some of the tax proposals, and one of my colleagues back then, he said, never gonna happen, over my dead body. And now, 4-6 years later, the proposal has been adopted, and he's alive and well. So surprising things can happen. Under the leadership of Pierre Moscovici, 14 different pieces of tax legislation has been passed in Council by unanimity so far. So it's not undoable. The problem is that we have a couple of very important pieces of legislation that has not been passed. One is the common corporate consolidated tax base. And that is important because even if we start talking about a minimum corporate tax, if you can play around with the tax base, well, then the minimum level of tax may not mean anything. So you need both if you want to progress in this area. The second thing we're still missing is the public country-by-country reporting. It works in the financial sector. The last time I looked, we still had a financial sector. So it doesn't seem to be too damaging. And I think any CEO could be proud to tell the number of employees, activities, turnover, profits, and taxes paid. And that will also allow us to have a completely different perspective on taxation also as individuals. And this is why I'm still sort of hopeful in the working way that we can get a global agreement on digital taxation. If that is not the case, obviously, we will table and push for a European solution. And I admire the member states who have said, well, we want a European or a global solution. If that not be, we are willing to do that by ourselves in order to be able to answer to all the businesses who pay their taxes.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yes, I would like to follow up on that. It's clear that some legislative measures on tax have been held up in Council, so perhaps then it would be important to work on Article 116, so this isn't based on unanimity in Council. So when we're talking about the corporate taxation, the digital taxation, the country-by-country reporting, we have a qualified majority decision instead. Are you going to move forward in this direction? Your colleague, Mr. Gentiloni, said something similar, unless I misunderstood. So that would be then two possible commissioners who'd be working towards this.
Yes, I find that the possibilities of using 116, they are indeed there. Now we have a process where every member state, obviously, are invited to take part. But 116 will say, well, if a member state or some member states, they have provisions that are harmful to competition, you can take up negotiations with that member state in order for them to change those provisions. If that is unsuccessful, you can table proposals, and those proposals, they can be decided in a normal or the ordinary legislative decision-making process. And I think definitely that we should start exploring what would that entail. Don't think that it's a given that it will be successful, but I think it's important that we take the different tools that the treaty gives us and use these tools if need be.
Thank you. Now we conclude the first round. For the second round of questions, I give the floor to the ITRE chair, Ms. Leyen.
Yes, thank you. Not for a question, though, but to give you the floor. So the first speaker is going to be Markus Ferber. He is EPP coordinating in ECON. Markus.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vestager. I'd like to return to the question raised by my colleague, Mr. Epic, because this was not a sufficient response. If you had said this 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, that's a complete answer. But now you're going to be an executive vice president, a very broad portfolio, 3 committees or hearings. This last time it was just 1. So we're talking about conflict of interest. I think in the new portfolio you have, it's very different than what you've described. If we listen to you, we'd have to get the impression that we really don't need a competition commissioner because everything is going to be done excellently in the direct. But however, in the Juncker Commission, the clear rule was that at the beginning, you have the dossiers you couldn't look at them. So this protection isn't going to really function. How are you going to address this inherent conflict of interest?
Of course, you're right to say that it takes some care. Because the working arrangement that we have had is that I can take a number of decisions by empowerment. I'm still responsible to my colleagues. When we have important decision, obviously, it is by the college. So far, we have had no in-depth discussion in college about competition decisions. But obviously, we follow every procedure. We go through the different steps of the weekly meeting of heads of cabinet before we get there, so that it is true collegial decisions, because that is how things are supposed to be. The second thing is, and I think it's a very impressive title that I'm going to have. I think it's a very impressive portfolio that I'm going to have. But the legislative proposals, they will be with my colleagues. They will be with my colleague of single markets, of home affairs. That will not be my pen that will draw them. I will work with them, yes, but when it comes to the individual proposal, that will be for my colleagues to write those. And I think it's important not to underestimate what the treaty tells us about how this should work. Because on the one hand side, we have the non-negotiable independence of law enforcement. On the other hand side, we have the benefits of generalized market insights for colleagues working on legislative proposals. And if we don't have that, well, then there is a risk that we'll never get to what I find to be a very constructive familiarity between law enforcement and regulation. I think we'll also discuss today some of the issues of big tech, of data, what it means when you de facto own a market. And here I think regulation is actually what we need. So we have to take what the treaty has given us for granted, what the courts have told us to be a way to organize it that is in accordance with human rights, and to have the checks and balances in the specific decision-making upheld.
Thank you. A follow-up question, Mr. Ferber?
Ja, ich darf das direkt auf.
Yes, let me pick this up. Digital markets develop very quickly, and competition procedures go a lot slower. And this analysis of a position of market domination, well, you end up with different opinions as a result, depending on how you view the world. Don't you think for the digital world you need faster competition procedures, faster procedures that lead to a decision? Because 6 years with Google, well, that means that you end up with a complete domination of the market before you even have a response from the DG.
two perspectives on that. First, as you know, of course, we have for the first time in 20 years started the procedure of intermediate measures. We have taken, of course, no decision because also here we respect that the company will defend themselves. That is one. The second thing is that one, of course, could consider what kind of tools do we need. We look at what has been proposed in the Netherlands, what they have been able to have in the UK, where they have different ways of trying to sort of reorganize a marketplace if the competition authority finds that the way it's working is not beneficial for fair competition. And those are tools that could be considered in order sort of to reorganize before harm is done. Then you don't punish because no infringement is found, but you can give very direct almost orders, which are, of course, can be appealed to the court, as to how a market should be organized. Because one of the things that are inherent in a digital economy is that sometimes you don't just see competition within the market, you also see competition for the market. Like here in Europe, we've very much had a competition about the market for search. And this has been won by Google. And when you win a market, you become de facto the private regulator. And that, of course, we'll have to discuss. Because when you set the rules, then they will have to be for fair competition. And that is not a given, we know from Google 1, Google 2, and Google 3 cases.
Thank you. Next speaker is Madame Scholdemus, IMCO SND.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vestager. Margrethe, it's wonderful to see you here today. Those 5 years which have passed, you've issued fines to address the competition situation. That's nice and concrete. But now you're going to make Europe fit for the digital age. And you're saying you want to use this word trust and fairness. That sounds very nice to our social democrat ears. But what do you actually mean? Are these platform workers going to enjoy more workers' rights? What about children? How are they going to be protected from online gambling? Are you thinking about more legislation, more transparency, more enforcement? I would like to hear more details because it's extremely important we do something with this.
Vestager.
This is an excellent illustration of how many different things we should be working with in the coming years. And this is a very good illustration as to how fast we should be working. I think there's been quite a lot of frustration among many people because those people who work on a digital platform, they have very bad working conditions. And we're now looking at one of the possibilities for exceptions from competition rules, which already exist. And that would mean that those who are similar to someone who would be an independent worker, are they really dependent on their employers? Well, then they can be organized. And you can have a organized labor just as it would be in other jobs. So you could have a working agreement. And I think this is a priority for us because it's not enough just to refer this to national competition authorities because this is a pan-European question because some of these platforms, well, you can work on a platform in many different member states. So it's important you have the right to be organized as a worker. And being organized means you have better conditions. And that is the first example I'd like to give. Now, if we look about content, there is illegal content, and there's content which is very damaging because the intention of that content is to distort the public debate, for example, in elections. So I think we need to have a different approach to the different contents. And one of the ways of doing this is, it sounds maybe a bit abrupt, but we have a code of conduct that would mean that we could address some of the worst abuses. And so some of these large platforms and some of these software providers have agreed to this. They have signed off on that. Now, one of the questions you asked is, do we need more legislation? And of course, I think this is going to be a very interesting discussion. What are we going to do about the e-commerce legislation? That is from the year 2000, and this is going to be a very interesting discussion indeed to have with the Parliament.
Madam Schaldemus, follow-up question.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a very important discussion. But let me turn it in a different direction. 5 years. I assume you'll be approved. So after 5 years, what will the citizens, the consumers, the workers, what will they notice? How will they know that you have made Europeans ready for the digital age? Well, above all, I hope that they will thank their elected officials for the work done. I think that is going to be more obvious, because I think we'll have a different situation when you're a member of a parliament and elected by the citizens. But if we are going to have a concrete impact that can be felt, that we have to do quite a lot, because we're going to have to change the discussion on this topic, but we also have to carry out the legislation which has already been adopted. Because if we only look at new legislation, then the new legislation has to go through hearings, and then you have to have an impact assessment, and then another hearing, and then a commission proposal, and then it's discussed here, and then in the council. So if you want to have a concrete impact, well, then I hope that the Parliament will work with us to ensure that anything that is adopted is actually implemented, and that there's a follow-up on the implementation, because the legislators have adopted important legislation. And Mrs. Schaldemose herself has been part of this. So I think we should, the respect for the legislation is something very important for this.
Thank you very much. Now, next speaker is Mr. Løkkegaard from the new group IMCO.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Danish, so this is time to hear beautiful language. Mrs. Vestager, in your response to the Parliament, you said SMEs are the very backbone of the European economy. More than 95% of enterprises fall into the SMEs. But let me look at it in terms of legislation. How can we support the SMEs with perhaps less burdens of a legislative nature? What would you do in concrete terms to support these SMEs, but to really help them develop their full potential in the digital economy? Is there something we can do? Are there thresholds we can set to make it easier for SMEs? Above all, I think that enterprises are not looking at Brussels and what we're doing here and thinking, that's where our business comes from. They have enough to do just dealing with their own enterprises, because they need to have access to a market, they need customers, and that helps the enterprises grow quickly. And I think you're correct in saying that we could be much better at saying what legislation should apply to the large enterprises and what should apply to the small enterprises. And I think the Parliament has been following this line in quite a lot of legislation, because the SMEs are the majority of enterprises. One of the things we can do for those enterprises who want to create more potential is to have access to public procurement, that you fully use the public procurement rules, because that's one of my points that my colleague has been looking at, that to ensure the full exploitation of the public procurement rules. And if you're in a sector where the tendering is made, for example, for the European Defence Fund, there's a special instrument for the SMEs, and that the Juncker investment plan has insured contracts for 900,000 SMEs. So I think what we're underestimating is the access to qualified employees. Many enterprises can't find the necessary employees in order to grow. So that's why training and education is so important. And I think that the European institutions enjoy very limited competence vis-a-vis training and education, but I still think this is something we have to address, especially when we're talking about digital skills. It's very obvious that you can't find an enterprise who doesn't want to use these digital skills.
Mr. Løkkegaard.
Tak for det.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think there's some very promising perspectives, but I think there's a way to go yet to reduce the burden on enterprises. Let me point an example that I saw, which is the Access Directive. And one of the places where we helped the micro enterprises and the SMEs to be part of the scope and part of the framework that we were creating. And that really had a huge impact for them, because it's very important that legislation should not be burdening these SMEs. Is this something that you could imagine ensuring in other areas in the digital spectrum?
Vestager.
Yes, I would like to do that. It requires quite a lot of effort. I have been working on this earlier, back in Denmark, in fact, and it is very difficult to reduce an administrative burden. And the best thing you can do is prevent that they are invented or exist. And so what you need is a kind of screening in all of our work. I think that's the approach we need to take, and we want to see if there are digital solutions to help reduce red tape. Perhaps we can get data flowing in a different fashion, because perhaps earlier you needed someone to be employed in the half-time. Perhaps you can now do it digitally instead. So I think be careful that we shouldn't promise too much. I think they get tired of hearing that now it's all going to be easier. And, of course, we very much hope we can get assistance from the SME Business Envoy, who's going to be helping us with this, who will be focusing precisely on this matter.
Thank you. Next speaker is Pilar del Castillo Vera.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I cannot agree more with your mission letter and the need to ensure that Europe's competition policy and rules are fit to the digital age. We see astonishing developments in artificial intelligence and Internet of Things. We are fighting for very high-capacity networks and 5G deployments. And I must say that the EU, through competition law, has done a lot regarding access to physical infrastructure. But, however, we have digital infrastructures, such as app stores, digital wallets for payments, or search engines. And in some cases, all this infrastructure has become unintended critical gateways that are creating a number of barriers to compete, innovate, or reach customers. And my question is, in those cases, what will you do to eliminate the new bottlenecks, such as inflexible terms for access, limited access to operating system functionalities, or access to user transaction data? Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Vestager.
Europa ser jo meget
I think in
connected when you look at the general numbers. But I think sometimes if you live in the countryside, you feel, no, it's not working. So there's also a digital divide that we'll have to close, to keep investing also outside of areas where there is a thorough business idea. So it's just to say that we have also sometimes in our physical infrastructure a gatekeeping that I think is felt very present for a number of people. When it comes to the gatekeeping as such, the legislation platform to business is going to be coming into effect quite shortly, I think by summer next year. And that will allow you as a business, depending on a platform, to know, to have transparency as to how am I ranked, and if I'm not to be found anymore, why is that? And also to have access to a dispute-solving mechanism, that you can go somewhere and say, it doesn't work anymore. What do I do to make it work? That was made in a very prudent way, not so to overshoot the regulation, but at the same time was created an observatory so that if need be, that we can increase these obligations. Because the gatekeepers, when you own the market, if they don't apply sort of privately set rules of fair competition, then obviously we have an issue. And as said, in a number of the competition cases, we have seen that when you de facto own a market, the rule you set is not, I will ensure fair competition, it is my own products first. And this is why we have to keep focusing on what happens if you have a dominant company in these very fast-moving markets.
A follow-up question.
I insisted for digital infrastructure, which is another dimension to be tackled compared to physical infrastructure. Anyway, in a context where Europe's competitiveness is subject to intense international competition, we urgently need an European industrial agenda, ambitious, with visible targets, concrete figures, dates and specific actions, as we have done for digital and climate policy. On the other hand, taking into account that what in Europe is perceived as big might be of a modest side international perspective, international marketplace, my question is, if you are to implement a strong industrial policy, do you foresee a need to adapt and how Europe's competition policy or rules?
Thank you, Madam Vestager.
One specific example as to how we are using rules now is the work that we do with member states to create these important projects of common European interest. We have one already on microelectronics with, I think, 5 member states and 40 different businesses that come together in a structure to develop next generation of microelectronics, which will serve us very well, actually also in climate change, because these new chips, they will use less energy than the ones we have already. And this structure will then allow for knowledge to be distributed, and it will unlock private investments. About for €1 invested by a member state, 2 to 3 euros will be invested by a private company. And so far we have learned a lot that we don't have to change these rules, but can apply them in practice in a more flexible way. The Battery Alliance is another example of that. And here we focus not on specific sectors, not on that industry or that industry, but on areas where we find that there has been a market error and where the full value chain can come into effect. And that, I think, is a very good example of a competitive-based industrial strategy.
Okay, thank you very much. Next speaker is Madame Kaili. She's from S&D ITRE.
Thank you for your answers. You're raising our expectations to make Europe globally competitive in the digital age. So I would ask you, the European Commission President-elect used the term technological sovereignty. How can we remain open to innovation and avoid the trap of over-protectionism? My second question would be, you said about reciprocity, that there are, besides tax rulings, other state aid, like in China. What tools did you have in mind to design, if you could be more specific? And furthermore, based basically on your experience, isn't it crucial now to redefine what constitutes abuse of dominant market position in the digital era by expanding it to include also possession of data as an element to the current law? Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Vestager.
Well, I think that's a very good point, to say, well, we have to figure out what constitutes market power. Because sometimes, sort of, if you take an old school example of market power, you'd say, well, it's market shares, it's the way that works. But when you are capable of collecting a lot of data, you may not have a huge turnover as such, not with that side of your business from the direct users. You may have it the one you sell advertising to, but just the same. So, of course, we will expand our insights as to how this works. And we have learned a lot from some of the merger cases that we have been doing to see how data can work as an asset for innovation, but also as a barrier to entry. Because if you don't have the right data, it's very difficult to produce the services that people are actually asking for. And that becomes increasingly critical when it comes to artificial intelligence. Because once you have it, well, then you can do even more. And I think we have to discuss what we do with all the amazing publicly funded data that we make available. It's not to be overly biblical, but we shouldn't end up in a situation where those who have shall more be given. That if you have a lot already, then you also have the capabilities and the technical insights to make very good use of it. And we do have amazing data in Europe. Just think about what can be assessed in our supercomputing investment. Now I think we have 7 or 8. They are world-class. You don't find it anywhere the same scale. And second, what we do when it comes to both Galileo and Copernicus, also here data is available, which is an excellent thing for the farmer doing precision farming and saving in pesticides and seeds and all of that. But are we really happy that we also make it available for those who could actually pay for it themselves? I think that is a discussion that we will have to make sure that not just the big ones keep taking for themselves, but the smaller ones having a fair chance.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. In the field of artificial intelligence that you mentioned, do you think that Europe could become a global player on development and deployment while enforcing high ethical standards across the industry by law or by design? And I give an example, protecting citizens that being excluded by insurance companies based on their AI ranking. And in your assessment, how can we avoid a simplistic one-size-fits-all framework for the use of data across completely different industrial sectors, like defense or creative and health sector? As you said, scientists are struggling to get good quality data, and at the same time we have weaponized AI. So should we have one-size-fits-all or not? And because you mentioned trust, I would like to ask you, we are unaware of data that are being collected from our microphones or cameras while we are not using applications. Shouldn't we have more options there? Citizens should have more options. And if you could elaborate also a bit in avoiding overprotectionism. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vestager.
Well, I don't think that we can be world leaders without ethical guidelines. I think we will lose it if we just say, no, let's do as they do in the rest of the world. Let's just pool all the data from everyone, no matter where it comes from, and let's just invest all our money. I think we will lose out. Because the artificial intelligence you create because you want to serve humans, that's a different sort of artificial intelligence. This is artificial intelligence with a purpose. And if you look at where Europe is good, then you see healthcare, environment, mobility. You see all the things that we need in order to create a still better society. We have a lot to build on, but we tend to see this as invisible assets. And we have to appreciate them in order to build on those. And that, I think, we can do, and obviously we should do. And in order to do that, yes, we can become world leaders. But the trust we built will also make sure that people say, well, this is for me. This is not against me. And that is what a society is about.
Well, thank you. Next speaker, Madam Scott Cato. She's from Greens Econ Committee.
Thank you. I'm delighted that President-elect Ursula von der Leyen committed to proposing a European Green Deal in her first 100 days. We need to make sure that our competition rules support rather than inhibiting this vital investment for the climate. I'm aware that your team is currently revising the state aid guidelines governing the energy sector, and I'm interested in exploring how you plan to support what you call in your mission letter the adaptation to a climate transition. So will you establish an internal audit for checking the consistency of state aid decisions with the EU's decarbonisation targets? Will you ensure that the objective of greenhouse gas reductions is reflected in the upcoming revision of the state aid guidelines for energy, and that they restrict disguised aid granted to fossil fuels, such as closure aid for coal mines and compensation for stranded assets? And do you intend to broaden the scope of environmental aid under the General Block Exceptions Regulation, excluding from its scope aid granted to airports?
Madam Vestager.
Yes, you're right to say that we have started, a full first fitness check and then eventually review of a huge number of our guidelines. One thing is running ahead of that program, and that is the guidelines for the European emission trading system, the ETS. And that is because we want to be ready when the new trading period starts. So that is a thing to be aware of, that we will start a public consultation on that within a relatively short time frame. And here, obviously, our goal is to make sure that as few sectors as possible can be compensated for direct or indirect cost of emission. What are they called? The thing they have to buy in order to be able to emit. And that I would we'll get to discuss this because obviously we try to limit the list as much as possible. That will have to be seen in consideration with the carbon border tax, because that's another element. Because the reason why we have the ETS guidelines is, of course, that there is a risk of carbon leakage. So the two things will have to be seen in parallel, but we just have to move relatively fast. On the rest of the pack, obviously, the Green Deal will be part of our consideration. One thing, though, has to be taken into consideration, and that is that we don't give state aid. States give state aid. What we check is that when they give state aid, that it doesn't harm competition, that it doesn't affect trade. So the state aid guidelines, well, they are part of the entire Green Deal framework as to what member states sign up to. On the question of airports, because as you said, we just actually enlarged the general block exemption regulation for small regional airports to be part of that. And as long as member states find that it is needed, and it can indeed be for connectivity reasons, I think they will stay in there.
Very well. Follow-up?
The transition to a green economy necessitates plenty of public money to support sustainable activities. However, since the beginning of the financial crisis, the banking sector has been benefiting from €650 billion of state support in the form of capital injections for some fairly questionable cases of resolution. Do you intend to complete a long overdue revision of the 2013 banking communication in order to align it with the resolution framework so that we can be sure money that's urgently needed for the Green Deal is not diverted towards bankrupt institutions?
Madam Vestager.
There is a new, I don't know if you'd call it tendency, but at least what we see is that fewer and fewer banks get into trouble, and that obviously is a good thing. But we also see that there is a growing appetite for member states to do schemes that are no aid. It's not state aid, they have market conformity. Member states invest as a market investor would do that. And that has been quite helpful in order to get rid of some of the non-performing loan portfolios. That has been a drag on the financial systems in a number of member states. So we see that the banking communication is indeed still, in a number of areas, fit for purpose. And there will still be an element of state aid control also eventually when the full banking union will be in place. So we are quite considerate not to overrush it, because we still see that the financial crisis has a long end in some of these loans that people actually cannot pay. So in that respect, we are cautious. That being said, what we see in our state aid work is that member states, they really invest in renewable energies. I agree, sometimes, yes, they make a capacity mechanism, and one could question that, but it is with the purpose of investing big time in renewables.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Jouvin. He is from ID Group. ECON.
Merci. Madame
Thanks, Chairman. Mrs. Vestager, congratulations on your past performances, and I'd like to ask a question that links into your written replies. You talked about your faith in the single market, but I can't help seeing that Europe's not really moving forward as much as it could when it comes to AI and digital. And it's very difficult for countries to catch up in a specific sector unless it protects itself by powerful tariff and non-tariff barriers. So my question is, how do you think you can help Europe catch up in terms of digital and AI without getting past the dogma of free trade, without calling into question some of the treaties that already exist, and without building up an effective external border to the single market as our Chinese and Russian rivals have done?
Thank you very much, Madam Vestager.
Well, one of the reasons that businesses grow is exactly that they can trade. I guess with your question as a background, you'd appreciate that most of trade is intra-EU trade. I think 2/3 of all trade is actually between member states. In order to catch up, and you're indeed right that there are a number of differences. If you see there is such an index of how digital you are as a member state. If you look at the 4 most digital member states, they are sort of at the same level as South Korea. The 4 member states who are the least digital ones, they are at the same level as Russia. So there is indeed catching up to do. And this is why the network among member states and among different agencies as member states is very important, but also and obviously in investment. Sometimes I think we underappreciate the European strength, because in the business-to-business digital sector, you see a completely different pattern than what you would evaluate as a private consumer using social media or media for connectivity. When you look at the business-to-business environment, you see a different patterns. So we indeed have something to build on, not necessarily just to catch up, but also to develop in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, where we have European programs. Obviously, they will have to be financed. So again, I call upon you to help us pass the budget in order not to lose time for these crucial investments.
Thank you. Follow up.
Bien volontiers, je me permets...
Yes, I'd like to follow up. Perhaps I could broaden out our discussions this afternoon. I think that the battle for digital might actually be already in the past, and biotechnology is a battle of the future in terms of industrial production of animal, vegetable, and even human products. And American and Chinese researchers believe that merging artificial intelligence and biotechnology is the battle of the future. This obviously means we need interdisciplinary, cross-cutting approaches. So my question is, have you thought about developing such approaches in your future role in the Commission? And if so, what have you thought of?
Thank you. Madame Vestager.
Well, in that, I will very much rely on my hopefully future colleague, Maria Gabriel, because she will be the one in charge of, hopefully, a gigantic research program. The Horizon Europe is a research program that will indeed be one of the answers to your question, because this is a massive European investment in research and development. And I think exactly what you're asking for, sort of the interdisciplinary projects, is one of the things that could be helped. Because in Horizon Europe, there is a test of a new approach. Sort of instead of having a lot of small cigar boxes, to have sort of a more programmatic effort to make sure that we don't sort of just put some money in some things to someone's darling and then to someone's darling and then to the third one, but are much more able to answer the calls for what happens in the scientific community.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Tosanovsky. He is ECR ITRE.
Thank you, Chair. I will speak in my mother language. Vážená paní Vestager.
Madam Vestager, in the near future, as part of Horizon 2020, there is going to be a selection of centers of excellence for artificial intelligence. Geographic balance among these is going to be important for our future. we need to make sure that countries across the EU are represented, including Central and Eastern Europe. Specifically, I know of a good Czech bid in this regard, but my question is more general. How do you want to make sure that the potential of artificial intelligence, as well as the potential of the investments in this area, is fully tapped into across the EU, so that across the EU we can benefit as much as possible from this new phenomenon, not only in a few countries, centers, and regions? Obviously, we have to maintain the level of excellence and scientific excellence. Thank you.
Madam Vestager.
This is also one of my worries, that everyone can be part of this development. Because just as well as it's important for artificial intelligence not to be biased when it comes to gender, it's very important that it's not biased because of geography. And since we have different languages, different cultures, different approaches, it is important that we come together in this development. I think my colleague commissioners in this commission have had a number of good ideas. And one of them, well, probably all, but one of them I will mention here is to have this network of innovation hubs, because that allows people coming from different parts of our union to be part of a common project. So it's not just this university or that university, it's also people who by themselves can be part of a scientific project, but coming from different parts of the union. Here, of course, I talk under the responsibility of Maria Gabriel, because she will know the details much better than I do, but it must be part of the effort. I very much appreciate that you mentioned at the same time that excellence must be the driver, but I think that we can actually square this circle and make both things happen. Thank you.
Thank you. A follow-up question?
Děkuji za první.
Yes, please, and thank you very much for the first answer. I really appreciated your answer, by the way. Secondly, the first 100 days, isn't that too ambitious a deadline for this program? In your answer, you're referring to a broad consultation. That's going to take a lot of time and a lot of energy. And also, this is such a comprehensive issue and so important for the future. If Europe is the lead in artificial intelligence, we cannot afford to over-regulate and to overburden by red tape if we want investment to come. Our political group would be more in charge of, would be more in favor, rather, of not hastening too much. So I'm wondering whether 100 days is simply not too ambitious.
Madam Vestager.
Well, it is very ambitious. And one of the things that I think about a lot is, of course, if we want to build trust, then you have to listen. You cannot just say, we have a brilliant idea, we make it happen all over. You have to listen to people to figure out, well, what would be the right approach here? Also because there is a balance. Because if you're developing something new, then exactly as you say, you should be very careful not to over-regulate. This was also the approach of the platform to business regulation, which was sort of the absolute necessary minimum, and then the observatory was created next to that in order to have the agility to be able to step in later. For me, to fulfill these ambitions, obviously, we need the feedback from the many, many businesses who have taken upon them to use the assessment lists and the principles of how to create AI that you can trust. But I also think that, well, to some degree, we have to listen fast, because we have to talk with a lot of different people in order to get it right. But it is a reflection of the fact that we are in a hurry. We really need to get our AI strategy off the ground, and these proposals will be part of that.
Thank you. Next speaker, Madame Kokalari. She's EPP IMCO.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner-designate. We really need to remove the barriers for a well-functioning single market in the digital age. uniform rules would really make it easier for European startups, for platforms and digital services to grow and scale up and meet global competition, especially from the US and China. You are tasked to draft this Digital Services Act in your mission letter, and you say that it will include liability and safety rules for digital platforms. Will you propose new rules concerning the responsibility and duty of care principle? If yes, how will you make sure that these new rules will be proportionate and justified and that they ensure the freedom to provide services? Will you modify the notice and takedown procedures? And if yes, what will your solution be to make sure that new rules that protect consumers from being deceived are effective but also business friendly? Tack så mycket.
Thank you, Madam Vestager.
Trevligt att träffas.
Nice to meet you.
Well, the first thing is to take stock. What do we have already? Because when it comes to a number of products that have embedded AI, a number of rules that we have already, they will also be applicable to those. Safety rules, things that will make sure that it doesn't burst into flames, that it doesn't exhaust fumes that are dangerous for your health. So we will have a lot of legislation already that will help us. And I think the important part is to make sure that we don't just redo the whole thing so it works as a layered cake, and we basically drown initiative and innovation in that process. So that is the first thing. And the second thing is that, and that I will very much like to discuss what will be the approach in the three committees here, is how to deal with the e-commerce directive. It's an old directive, yes, but some of the debates that will be unleashed, if that is taken up for revision, they will be very sort of principled debates, because they are indeed about the freedom of services and what kind of responsibility do you have if you provide a service for customers. There's just been a very, very important debate about the copyright directive. It was also a very divisive debate, and we still have to come the full implementation of that. So I think it's important to take stock. How do we most effectively reach a goal of having products that we can trust, that we feel protected in our privacy, before we launch a number of legislative acts in order to know exactly what it is that we want to achieve? Because I think you're completely right in pointing to the balance between efficiency in protecting the consumer and at the same time space for innovation for products that we don't know of yet. And that will be the tricky balance to be held.
Thank you very much. A follow-up question?
I would like to add if the Digital Services Act will also include services enabled by artificial intelligence. Can you be more concrete about that? Or will this be part of the European approach on AI? And secondly, would you be ready to present this upcoming proposal as a regulation and not as a directive in order to have a great level of harmonization in the interest of the single market? Thanks.
Vestager.
On a number of your questions, I simply don't know that yet. What form will be the best form to choose, regulation or directive? But the thing is that what we find more and more is that artificial intelligence is embedded in products. Products that we seem to know that will have an artificial intelligence side. And this is why a number of these questions come up. The product in itself, an electrical product doing things that we are used to, a fridge, for instance, well, on that, we have regulation already and different kind of product requirements for that to be safe. Then what happens if you embed artificial intelligence in that fridge to make sure that someone will always fill it for you with your preferred choice of products? And how to make sure that those preferred choice of products is actually your preferred choice and not someone else's preferred choice? That I don't know yet. How will we deal with this? And this is, of course, why when you enter into regulation, you should make sure that regulation is needed, and not just because that it kind of scares you. You have to know what it is that we want to achieve. And what I would want to achieve is for consumers to feel safe. I trust this product. I trust that I'm in control of this product. And that should be part of our endeavor.
Thank you. The continuation of the exchange will be chaired by IMCO. So, Madame de Sutter.
Yes, thank you. The next speaker on the list is Madame Stéphanie Yoncourtin, Renew ECON.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. Ms. Vestager, this is Act 2, if you like, a bit like those well-known TV shows like Borgen, and let's hope that we all liked Season 1. Let's hope that Season 2 is even better, because this new season's a season with twists in it, marked by digitalisation, and my questions are on digitalisation. Practically speaking, anti-competition ideas, it seems that big fines don't actually have much of a dissuasive effect because they are passed on to the consumer. How can they be made more effective? Would you recommend, at the last resort, break up? And how would you stimulate European companies to get better and become part of the top 10 of the digital economy? At the moment, we are conspicuous by our absence, particularly on the financial market and data markets. Are you favour of making certain we have a more healthy competition which will benefit consumers and small and medium enterprises?
Thank you.
Well, I'm happy that you refer to series, because when it comes to films and books, there's also with this difficult number 2. So you very often jump directly to number 2.5 or 3 in order not to have the difficult number 2. Well, I will do my best in the second season. I think you're right to say that, well, fines is not doing the trick. And fines is not enough, because fines is a punishment for illegal behavior in the past. What is also in our decision is that you have to change for the future. You have to stop what you're doing. You cannot do something with the same effect as the illegal behavior you had before. And some of the things that we will, of course, look into is, do we need even stronger remedies for competition to pick up in these markets? If you look, for instance, at the Google AdSense case, when we sent the statement of objection to Google about their illegal behavior in that market for third-party placement of ads, well, they stopped their behavior. That's now 2 years ago. The market hasn't picked up. So what do we do in that kind of cases? We have to consider remedies that are much more far-reaching. Also, before we reach the very, very far-reaching remedy to break up a company, we have that tool in our toolbox, but obviously it's very far-reaching. It is very, very intrusive to say to a company, you have to divest part of this company. And my obligation is to make sure that we do the least intrusive thing in order to make competition come back. And in that respect, obviously, I am willing to explore what do we need more in competition cases for competition to come back. And in that, we have to consider this new phenomenon that we have competition for a market, not just in a market, but for a market. And if you win that competition, you are the de facto rule setter in this market. How to make sure that these rules are set for fair competition? Well, that is what the Platform to Business proposal is sort of aiming at, but it will also be a question for us as competition law enforcers.
Madame Yoncourtin, follow-up?
Oui, face aux enjeux de...
In the light of the challenges of globalization, climate change and societal problems, European policy and competition policy needs to change and needs to fit better, dovetail better with industrial policy, digital policy, so that digital leaders from Europe can emerge. You talked about batteries. How do you think we can improve regulation as far as state aid is concerned, so as we more encourage industrial development for innovative projects in Europe, particularly through these significant projects of common interest? So we have much more things like the one you were talking about.
Well, I think the best thing when it comes to enabling projects of common European interest is to use the rules that we have. Because from the project of microelectronics to the project of batteries, we have learned a lot, member states have learned a lot, and getting still more agile in what is needed in order to get these projects in order. Because it's quite complex value streams. Because it's both, when you look at the work we do in the batteries, it is from the raw material to the different cells, to the blocks, to the recycling. So it's kind of innovating the entire value chain within that sector. And that is quite complex. And by using the tool, we get better and better at it. And I prefer more to use that tool than to, take a step back to the workshop and revise the entire tool. Because I think we have a number of important projects of common European interest sort of waiting for us to get settled in order to get that afloat. Just one more thing about this, the question of top 10. The interesting thing is that if you look at top 10 years ago, I think the only European company on that list was the Dutch Shell, so a fossil fuel company. The rest were also fossil fuels and banking companies. So the interesting thing, of course, is what kind of list do you want to be on? Because if you look at the list of the most important global companies in greening our economy, you find that most of them, they are European. Because there is a demand. There's been an investment. We want to green our economy, hence the businesses they work because there is a demand. And that, I think, we should use also when it comes to digital, in particular in the business-to-business relationship.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mr. Tennant, non-inscrit ITRE.
Thank you very much, Chair. Each proposed commissioner receives a mission letter, and I noticed that in yours, Ms Vestager, the following text. You will coordinate the work on digital taxation to find a consensus at international level by the end of 2020, or propose a fair European tax. Now, in my view, any attempt to impose a tax will harm competitiveness almost by definition, and many jobs will go to countries that aren't looking to impose a tax on the digital economy. Can I ask what form this new tax will take? How does this square with Brexit? Will there be any attempts to push the UK in line with these plans post-Brexit? If not, will you be worried about losing jobs to the UK? Are you proposing that this will be applied to all companies or just the large multinationals?
Mrs. Vestager.
Well, now we have a working process within the OECD. And that is in order to enable a global agreement. Some of the proposals by the OECD, or their sort of drafts in the working process, they look like what was suggested here in Europe when the digital service tax was suggested. Some of their draft proposals, they go in a slightly different direction. I don't know what will be the outcome yet, but I hope that they will work fast. Because in order to have a global consensus, you need proposals on the table to be able to discuss them. Part of the thing is, of course, as you say, well, if you can just move out of the tax zone, well, then you have achieved nothing. Because part of the idea is, of course, to make sure that where you do your business, where you generate your profits, you also pay your taxes because you contribute to a society that enables you to have your business running. And that, of course, is one of the principles that we will have to look for, because otherwise, well, we just have even more companies being headquartered in places where there's not much place for a headquarter, but only for a letterbox. How that will influence the Brexit situation, obviously, I don't know. But since I hope that it will be a global consensus, I would hope that the UK would be part of that global consensus.
Mr. Tennant, follow-up?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank God that we're leaving this political project, because all these ideas of taxation represent everything that is wrong with this union. Secondly, we joined to seek a common market, free trade, and now what we see is European-level taxation imposed without fair representation. That, to me, is unacceptable and is dangerously leaning towards censorship. The difference between the British people and your project is that you are pro-harmonisation, We are pro-sovereignty. Brexit, to me, is an opportunity to seek a better way to represent people and bring decision-making towards a more accountable democracy. So by all means, carry on, but Britain won't be taking part.
Mrs. Vestager.
Well, I don't share your views, but I appreciate your good wishes.
Thank you. Next speaker on the list, Mrs. Evelyn Regnier, S&D ECON.
Thank you very much. I come back to competition policy. You just said in your introductory remarks you plan changes on the application but not on the regulation. How do you then intend to tackle the abuse of dominant market positions, in particular by tech giants and digital platforms? And what about unhealthy competition between member states? Companies that post workers to other member states pay less social security contributions than companies that employ the workers domestically. The result is sort of a posting discount. Will you tackle this new problematic type of competition between member states the same way as you've been doing it concerning tax dumping practices? Will you make use of the state aid law as an instrument against this harmful competition?
Mrs. Vestager.
Unfortunately, I think that the question is a very good illustration of the limits of competition law enforcement and the need for well-working labour markets and for them to develop the well-working of labour markets. Because I think in the example that you state, that you don't pay the same social contribution, and thereby the other taxpayers, they de facto give a subsidy to the business who hires people or who provides a service in the country. I don't think that competition law can solve it. I think this is for different ways of labour market legislation, either nationally or across Europe. One of the things that I have very much appreciated in this Commission was the ambition to say, well, if you work the same place, you have the same kind of work, well, then you should also have the same salary. I guess that part of what you say is a way to try to work around that principle, to say that the non-wage elements that makes you competitive or not is actually then what is being in the focus. But I don't have an answer from the competition side of things, but obviously more than happy to continue the discussion also with colleagues for whom this is the direct responsibility.
Thank you. Follow-up?
So you mentioned before public CBCR and also that European tax legislation is slow, but it's not hopeless. So bluntly spoken, what will you personally actively do? The public CBCR is adopted, and are you committed to work on a European minimum corporate tax rate in order to end this terrible race to the bottom? Or to refer to the example you said just before, will you say, not over my dead corpse, in relation to the Danish colleagues you mentioned in your remarks before?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager.
Well, the story actually wasn't a Danish colleague. It's also part of the Danish language, and it doesn't work there either. No, but the thing is that from what I have seen in the work with taxation, is that yes, it is slow, but we have progress. I hope very much that from the state aid decision on tax, that member states and companies, they take guidance. We have given guidance also in the notice of how to understand aids, and we have tried to sort of push for sort of the understanding in tax administrations as to how to understand this, so that guidance is disseminated even though we don't have, of course, the final say of the courts, so that in that respect there is help. But as said, I don't think that the state aid cases will bring us tax justice. Only legislation will do that. And we need, I think, a combination of the three, the public country-by-country reporting, and I do hope that more member states, they will do what they can to achieve that, And second, a combination of a minimum corporate taxation and a common tax base. Because you need the common tax base in order not to play around with the tax base, because that would make the minimum corporate taxation irrelevant. So we need all three things, and hopefully we can push for that together.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mrs. Angelika Niebler, EPP Juri.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Mrs. Vestager. Now, in the hearing, you talked about copyright reform. You know that we worked some years on this copyright reform, which was then adopted. It's something that was generated a lot of controversy in public opinion. So what is your personal position on copyright reform with regards to the work that we did in Parliament? And secondly, will you ensure that the implementation of this directive is not weakened in any way by the implementation in the Member States? And how is this going to impact the new Digital Services Act? How do you see the links between the Digital Services Act and the copyright reform that we adopted in Parliament, as you're responsible for coordination and looking at the Digital Services Act and digital platforms and digital products and services, amongst others?
Mrs. Vestager.
As you will know, it was not something that I had a direct responsibility for, but I followed the debate. And I think it was a very divisive debate, but it was also a very strong debate, because it showed some of the very difficult balancing act that will have to be done in any kind of regulation, especially when it comes so close to who we are, what we can say, what we can do. I myself am very happy with the outcome. I think it is important that we now get a possibility for those who hold copyright actually to be remunerated. We have so many artists who lives as self-employed, who has a huge difficulty in making ends meet because they get very little for all the work they do. And I don't think any of us would want to live without the contribution from authors and journalists and singers and songwriters and actors and what have we. So I'm very happy with the fact that we landed a compromise. And now, of course, for the next Commission to give guidance to make the national implementation coherent, so we don't get fragmentation, even though we now have common legislation. That will be a task for the next Commission, and that will be difficult as well, because it is highly likely that some of the debates that were kind of settled with the compromise, they will come back in a different disguise. I think that now the copyright issue has been settled, and it shouldn't be reopened in the area of the Digital Services Act. I think it's important to be very careful not to do that, because then we would lose speed again when it comes to actually making sure that there is remuneration for those who hold copyright.
Mrs. Niebler, follow-up.
Thank you very much. I had another question with regards to sporting events being streamed on the internet. Often we have them illegally being streamed. The Commission issued some guidance with regards to this illegal streaming online. Are you going to follow up on this communication? Are you going to actually try and tackle this problem? What exactly is your plan to try and deal with this illegal live streaming?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager.
Oh, you know, I thought I had prepared so well. But for that question, I have not prepared at all. It will likely be difficult, and I recognize that it's an important question, because so much money goes into being able to stream it legally. And once you have paid to stream it legally, you don't want to see that streamed illegally in parallel or in other ways that harms sort of the business case for you investing actually in having the rights. But I have not thought about how to deal with the illegal side of things, so I'll have to come back to you on that.
Thank you. Next speaker, Madame Cornelia Ernst, GUE, ITRE.
Ja, Frau.
Mrs. Vestager, it's very nice to see you here once again. I'm over here. Now, in your answers, you were talking about competition as an important instrument to maintain or create jobs and to fight climate change. We see it the same way. However, there are regions that aren't competitive at all. I come from such a region in Germany. We have structurally very weak regions, and then we have some, for example, where we used to mine coal is now in a transition. So is competition enough, as you describe it? That's my question. What role does free and fair competition have in order to help a fair development of these regions? For example, it's not, you don't just want wolves living there, you also want people to live there. And what about some kind of aid? If you have want to balance this equation of assistance on one hand, aid, and free competition on the other.
Even though as you refer, I think competition is part of the answer, but I also recognize its limitations. And if an entire region is in transition, then you need to invest. You need to invest first and primarily in people, to give people the opportunity to reskill, to upskill, to get the skills that is needed for a renewed economy of that region. I think very highly of the Globalization Adjustment Funds. I think highly of the work that has been done by member states to give closing aid in coal mining regions. For a very long time, one could not give restructuring aid to coal mines, but to give closing aid in order to make sure that people were actually able to create new businesses, new jobs. But also for the aid that we give, for instance, if there is a risk that a company will locate themselves outside of the European Union, then you can give a subsidy actually to make them stay within the European Union, maybe in such a region. And here I think that what you want is for competition maybe to come back, but first you want to create the necessary preconditions for people to have a life. Because if there is no business, if there's no public service, if there's no way that you can transport yourself, well, then you don't ignite a new development. And that can only be done in common with the member state in question, the regional authorities, of course, and the civil society, using the help that the rest of Europe can give in the best possible way.
Thank you. The follow-up question?
Now, let's still think about the structurally weak regions. Now, you said we need a European industrial strategy. Fine. But what do we have to do differently? You have mentioned a few things, but that's not really a strategy per se. You just mentioned a few building blocks. What would a industrial strategy, a European industrial strategy, what would that have to take into account? Because these regions, using the funding we have currently, can only be helped to some extent. And so I think we're at a point where we have to make a decision. And it's nice to talk about a new strategy, but what kinds of points do you think are essential in this context?
Well, you have to excuse me for not being sufficiently specific, and I recognize that, that you don't think so, because I'm not. The first point, of course, is to make sure that such a strategy is not just for big business. Because Europe is not just big business. It's also many, many small and medium-sized businesses also when it comes to industry. A lot of businesses, they have subcontractors, they have more than one subcontractor, and that is the importance of the European fabric of industry, that you find it like that. So it should be for all of industry. Second thing is that it should be part of the Green Deal. We cannot have an industrial strategy that doesn't care about the greening of our economy and the transition into a carbon neutral continent. It has to be two sides of the same coin. And last but not least, it has to be on a foundation of fair competition. And this is also to say that this is not about handing money out to some business or to some sector. It is to invest in the value chain that enables a number of different sectors to prosper. A good example of that would be the important project of common European interest in microelectronics, where a number of member states and a huge number of businesses, they come together to innovate and to produce microelectronics that will be useful for many, many, many different sectors. And by doing that, enabling industry for a new takeoff.
Thank you. Next question by Mr. Timo Wölken, SND Juri.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Ms. Vestager, you will be in charge of Europe Fit for the Digital Age, and you will be responsible for artificial intelligence. There are, however, a number of challenges related to this. Businesses argue in favor of less regulation in order to allow for and boost the development of AI technology. As the main EU instruments governing AI today are GDPR and the e-privacy directive, it should be underlined that any initiatives from the Commission have to fully guarantee the respect of fundamental rights, such as the protection of privacy and personal data or non-discrimination. Due consideration should also be taken of the need to respect ethical and human aspects and create trust in these new technologies. How will you ensure that a Europe fit for the digital age does not undermine existing regulation or protection of fundamental rights, but uses these protections as a competitive advantage?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager?
Well, I completely share both where you start in your question and where you end. That the only way that we can be successful is to build the AI that we can trust, to build AI that actually is sort of based on fundamental values. We talk about privacy by design, but we should also talk about trust by design, because otherwise I think our society will reject it. Let's say we don't want this, we don't need it. And that would be really a pity, because the potential in health, in minimizing pollution, in fighting climate change, when it comes to using digital technologies, for instance, artificial intelligence, that's enormous. And this is why I really appreciate that we have started out with guidelines, how to create artificial intelligence that we can trust, that these guidelines have been put into assessment schemes. It is quite extensive, I'd say, looking at it, and that businesses are signing up. So it's not just sort of a desk exercise. It's not desk research. It is something for real. Businesses will say, well, I will use that in the development of our AI, and I will report back to you, because obviously I think a lot of businesses, they see, yes, there will be a need for regulation, but it should be a regulation that enables us and not disables us. Because they see the same perspective that what we have in Europe may not be all the data, because we actually do respect people. We may not have all the money, because we have a lot of things to spend on, but we do have purpose. There's things that we want to achieve, and that, I think, is the most important driver that you can have, exactly because it is based on our fundamental values.
Thank you. Mr. Wölken, follow-up?
Okay, I think we agree that it is vital in the digital age that we give power back to the individual to decide what is to be done with their privacy instead of making it a pure commodity. We need the e-privacy directive in order to let the individuals keep their right to self-determination and decision-making free from influence they have not agreed to. With the e-privacy directive, we would be able to regulate the advertisement-driven business models we know, and we wouldn't have to wait for a market response you mentioned earlier. We need to set clear privacy-friendly rules, and that's why I have the question how you will ensure that an agreement can finally be reached on the much-needed regulation on e-privacy. And in addition, as Ms. Niebler mentioned, the copyright directive, directive, we agreed to upload filters. How will you ensure that these technologies will not endanger the freedom of speech during the implementation by the member states?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager.
Well, the last issue, I think, will take a lot of discussions and back and forth between member states. Commission, probably also this Parliament, will follow this very closely to make sure that we get an implementation in member states that are similar, instead of having one variation of the copyright direction in one member state and a quite different variation of the copyright direction in another member state. And one has to be very careful because, as said, I think some of the discussions that we had during the adoption of the copyright directive will come back, because these are crucial debates, because it's a debate between the freedom of speech and actually protecting people who have rights, which is completely justified. And this is a debate that you can settle, and then it will come back, because it's one of, just as well as we have fundamental values, we also have fundamental discussions, because it's always a balancing act how to get this right. I share with you the need to pass the e-privacy directive. Right now, I don't know what are the blocking things in that, but it will be high priority to make sure that we be able to pass that, because I share with you that it will be an important building block. One of the things I hope is that we don't just always sort of decentralize to the individual citizens. Now you have rights, now you just go enforce them. Because I know I have rights, but one of my frustrations is how to enforce them. Because I am to read page after page after page, and if I'm not tired and just forget about it, then I sign up anyway. And that doesn't really make sense. We still have to do more for people to feel empowered to protect themselves.
Thank you. Next question by Mr. Damian Busselager from the Greens, ITRE.
Thank you, Chair. Mrs. Vestager, you've already touched upon, the intersection of industrial strategy and competition policy, and I want to come back to that. In your last mandate, you consistently stood up against demands from member states to water down European rules of merger control, and who wanted to somehow create European champions. We supported your position because strong competition rules allow SMEs and startups to compete fairly with incumbent firms and thereby protect the decentralized dynamism of all businesses, big and small. However, reading your written responses to our questions last week, it was unclear to me what exactly you meant by, and here I quote, A, developing tools to guarantee fair competition both in the single market and at the global level, and B, re-examining the practical aspects of our enforcement, including aspects such as market definition. So my question is, have you changed your point of view? Or more concretely, would you, after such a re-examination of the market definition, rule differently on a case like the Siemens-Alstom merger?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager?
The short version is no. Because the thing in the Siemens-Alstom merger was not so much the merger as such. We're talking about two European champions who wants to merge. But couldn't or wouldn't solve the competition problems that we had. None in old-school locomotives, none in trams, none in metros, none in metro signal and system, but in two specific markets of very high-speed trains and mainline signaling. And that will be exactly the same. The point is to say, when we do a market assessment, then what we're looking for is, would there be someone that customers can turn to if the merging businesses, they have higher prices or lower quality? And as long as you can turn to someone else, well, then there is still a market for you. And sometimes I think that may not be exactly sort of how you read the notice that we have on how we do this work. And if you just read the notice that is 20 years old, you may not get sort of the full value and quality of what it actually is that we're doing. I had two academics look at 15 cases in how we do this market assessment, and they found that we were in line with also how this is done globally. And that is the important thing. I really would like people to be able to read our rules and understand what it is that we're doing. The second thing is that I think it's very important that we also work with others here, because the integrity of the single market comes from a number of different sources. will have to be fully implemented and will, I think, also have to have some kind of reciprocity. I mentioned it before, but we invite a lot of people to come here and do business. The public procurement market in Europe is 14-15% of European GDP. It is 2 trillion euros. It's a 2 with 12 zeros in euros. It's a lot of money. We invite people to come and do business, and we are not invited back. And where I come from, if you're not invited back, well, then you stop inviting people.
Thank you. Mr. Busselager.
Yeah, thank you for the short answer and for the long one. My follow-up question is a bit more on what you touched upon in your intro remarks on climate change and digital transformation as being the key trends, and I think they're interlinked to an extent. So my question is, digital technologies such as AI pose substantial opportunities to help our economy to become more climate neutral. And I mean, there are many examples, for example, that decentralized renewable energy production or optimizing energy usage can help us get away from fossil-based infrastructures. So what concrete policy measures will you prioritize to support the development of digital technologies that contribute to fighting climate change? And will you limit the rebound effect of additional energy and raw material consumption from digitization?
Thank you, Mrs. Vestager.
One of the things is obviously to make sure that we also have more digital technologies, because a lot of digital technologies, they are extremely energy consuming. I read about a quantum experiment, and once they turned off the bottom, basically they used the entire energy of the city I grew up in. Well, it was not a big city, but anyway. So there's a lot to be done just within digitization in itself. One of the things that we are working on is a very important project of common European interest within batteries. And one of the things that I find personally very interesting is to include sort of the entire recycling practice of that. So that precious raw materials, the entire sort of logistics of how you use batteries is sort of part of the innovative process. Because I think if we push innovation also in how we organize ourselves, we can have much better use of the technology that we have already, and that will help us to increase speed in how we fight climate change. And part of that can be done with digital means, because you can follow resources to a different degree than what you could before. Here, of course, I will work with my colleague Maria Gabriel, because she will be head of the Horizon Europe project, and part of these processes will be funded by that.
Thank you. Next question by Mr. Billy Kelleher, Renew ECON.
Thank you, Madam Vestager. Just very briefly, in the mission letter that was sent to you by the President of the Commission, she states to you, you will co-lead the work of a new SME strategy. This should focus on supporting small businesses, entrepreneurs, start-ups, notably by reducing the regulatory burden and enabling them to make the most of digitisation. So I suppose the question really is in the context of small and medium-sized businesses being asked to embrace the green economy, the digital economy, to invest in research and development, to invest in their employees and training, and to scale up. One of the biggest challenges facing them is access to credit, access to seed capital, and access to finance. So in the context of you being previously the Commissioner for Competition, and now in your new role in transforming and making Europe more economically efficient, how will you remove barriers to access to finance for small and medium-sized businesses to allow them scale, to allow them to invest, and to allow them grow?
Thank you. Mrs. Vestager.
This Commission has passed legislation to allow us to develop a European capital market. But one thing is passing legislation, another thing is actually to make it happen. And it will be part of the work of my colleague, Valdis Dombrovskis, who is also responsible for an economy that works for people and for sustainable financing. But the good news is that we now have a legislative basis that will allow us to develop this. And I think it's very important that sort of the usual bank financing, where you go to the bank and you create a debt, that is supplemented with going to the capital market. Because sometimes when you want your business to grow, you need capital, but you need also more or different kinds of knowledge that comes with that kind of capital. People who may buy 5 or 10% of your business, and they take an interest. They come with knowledge that allows you to grow. And that is part of the solution. But we should also make sure that we have instruments that can provide for financing. The Juncker investment plan provides for financing for 900,000 small and medium-sized businesses. And that, I think, is a good act to follow, to make sure that you can actually provide financing and allow people to grow. I think another aspect, and I know that we in the European democracy has little competence, but that is to allow for upskilling and reskilling of people. To be able to hire skilled people is a very important factor for your business to grow. And even though you digitalize and you can do things easier with digital solutions, you still need skilled people on board. And this is why educational policy and lifelong learning is not a soft tool anymore. It's a hard tool if you want the European economy to work.
Thank you. Mr. Kelleher, follow-up?
Just in terms of the challenges with small and medium-sized businesses, you just mentioned upskilling, investment in retaining staff and employees. I mean, one of the biggest challenges is to compete with multinationals for a pool of talent. So in that context, again, where do you see your strategy in terms of incentivising small and medium-sized businesses to invest in upskilling their employees, as has been questioned by many people here today?
Mrs. Vestager.
Well, part of that is working with national authorities, but also to create programs that allows you to gain new skills while still employed. And in that, distance learning is part of that answer. Because nowadays it's something completely as to what it was. Not just watching a lecture online. It's also tests, games, videos, instructions in a completely different way that allows you to more integrate new learning in your everyday work life. And in that, I think also member states can inspire one another. And hopefully we can recruit more people also to acquire digital skills. I know it's one of the priorities of Maria Gabriel, but I think it's one of the things that we'll all have to help her with to make sure that digital literacy and also for women to come into the digital sector, that is a question of priority. Because otherwise, well, then we don't get all the potential and all the talent that we need.
Thank you. And then the final question, Lydia Pereira from EPP, also from ECON.
Obrigada, Sra. Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ms. Vice President Designate, as you're aware, society is going through huge changes caused by digitalisation. From consumption, the way we pay for what we buy and the way it's made, digital is going to change our lives. Companies and consumers are coming up with non-online responses to problems, and these things, of course, don't recognise border. And the question of taxing these in various countries is very difficult. And Digital Europe, of course, is still working with companies that only pay taxes in one real country, even though they make money in all of them. Data from the European University Institute, through a coordinated study, says that citizens would back a European tax on digital services. So I think we need specific responses here. What's your vision on reform of digital services taxation in the European Union, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Vestager.
Well, we do indeed need one, because many businesses, they pay their taxes. Many of them would be small and medium-sized businesses. They create the jobs, they take young people on board to learn them their trade, they pay the taxes. In order to answer all those businesses that this is a level playing field, that there is a sense of fairness, obviously also their digital competitors with whom they compete for capital, for skilled employees, for customers, if they don't contribute to society where they do their business, I think a sense of unfairness is very much felt. We were not successful in the first push for a digital services tax. Individual member states have then taken up to do that themselves. I admire that because obviously they do something extraordinary. I hope that will give the much needed pressure first and hopefully to find a global solution, a global agreement as to how this is done. If that is not the case, I think that we should do it ourselves. And obviously we commit to produce a proposal if there is not a global agreement by the end of 2020.
Thanks very much. Just to clarify things for me, how can we tax people who operate in one country and make money in another and transfer their income? Can you nibble away at companies' profit margins in that way? I think we're basically in agreement. I think that when Europe moves into this area, it needs to have an international agreement on this topic. And I'd like to stress we shouldn't compromise our possibility in terms of innovation and attracting investment. But could you give me a bit more detail about how you think your actual tax would function, please?
Well, as I said, the OECD, they're working on it as we speak. But what was the idea in the proposal that my colleague Pierre Moscovici tabled was exactly to say, well, you make a profit where you interact with users. You may own the algorithm, and you may get part of the data, but the value is only created when people use your services. This is where value is created. And since people use your services where they live, where they work, where they transport themselves, then value is created on ground. You may be headquartered in a completely different jurisdiction, but you still make value where people use your services. And that was the idea, to say, well, when you make value because you interact with your users in these many different countries, you should also contribute with the profits that you make here to this country where your profits are enabled. And that was a very fundamental idea. And the reason was to say, well, since corporate taxation was invented before anything became digital, we also have sort of to make corporate taxation understand the world that we live in. Because if corporate taxation doesn't understand the world we live in, then more and more and more corporations will stop paying taxes because things become more and more digital. Also, what we are used to think about, sort of real, sort of tangible goods, things that are very difficult to move, they get a digital side. The value creation in the aftermarket may be the important thing of that market as well. So this is why there is a sense of urgency. And this is, of course, also why it would be best to have a global agreement. If that is not the case, we should act on our own.
Thank you very much. So this concludes also the second round of questions. I want to thank all the members of the 4 committees present here that have asked questions, and of course Mrs. Vestager for the answers. And as you know, we invite you now for a brief closing statement of no more than 5 minutes before closing this meeting. Mrs. Commissioner Designate, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a very broad area that we have covered today. I think it is very important that, for me, this, hopefully, if you confirm me, this is the beginning of a working relationship. Because nothing can be achieved if we don't work together. And the second thing is that you're all elected. You have a public mandate. I'm just selected. Picked out by a government, said, you go be the commissioner. And this is why this is very important for me. Because it's only with your acceptance that I have democratic legitimacy in doing the job that I'm supposed to do. So this is why it means a lot to me, if confirmed, to be able to work with you, to strive to find solutions also on very difficult issues. As said, I think that some of the debates that we had on the copyright directive will come back when member states will implement. Some of the difficult discussions will come back when we'll discuss the Digital Services Act, because we'll figure out how to deal with the e-commerce directive that will almost now celebrate its 20th anniversary. That's a long time for something, addressing something digital, still to be relevant. So that will be a thorny discussion as well. But first things first, I'm sorry to say this, we need the money. We need funding. We need the programs. We need to be able to do something so that people can see that businesses can use funds to invest in innovation, that researchers can make their networks work all over Europe, that they get the funding actually to get there. And in that respect, I hope that you will help push for the multi-annual financial framework to be in place. I don't think that Europeans have any patience for us when it comes to these different things that we would like to make all these things that we would like to be real. So that is now, that is here. And that, I think, is very important. I also hope that you will bear with me, that I will come back and ask you what you think. Because some of these questions we will not have the answer beforehand. We will consult with you, just as well as we will consult with NGOs, civil society, industry as well. As we have touched upon a lot of times, on the guidelines for how to create artificial intelligence that we can trust. How to translate that into something that will enable us to do what we want to do. That will take a lot of discussions before we have the right solution to do that. The most important thing for me and the most important takeaway from today is the interest and the commitment and the in-depth engagement in the very different issues. And if one didn't think it before, I think had one heard the questions of this hearing, you would see that Europeans have representatives who think of our fundamental values and our democracy as our strength in a still more challenging world. And also as a citizen, I find that to be comforting. But there's no cynicism. There's no let's do as the Chinese. There is let's do this the European way. Because this is where we find our strength, to make Europe the best that she can be in order to serve us all as citizens. And in that, and for all your questions, I'm deeply thankful. So thank you very much.
Well, let me also thank you, Madam Vestager, for your answers, colleagues for your questions. I think they were very interesting. I don't want to preempt the result of the hearing, but just to thank you at this stage. And remind you that we have a coordinators evaluating meeting in a few minutes. Madam Tinagli.
Not much to add. Thank you. Thank you to the colleagues. Thank you, Madame Vestager, and thank you to Mrs. Valian and Mrs. Sutter. So we will soon go into evaluation. Thanks. The meeting is closed.